Hello and welcome to another video in the series Talking with Dan Gibson. If you would like to have a question answered or if you'd like to contact me in any way, please use the email address at the bottom of your screen, dan@canbooks.ca. In this series, we are continuing on looking at three books. We've looked at the first book already, The Nabateans, Builders of Petra. In this particular segment, we're going to look at the book Quranic Geography. And we're going to ask a little bit about what is this book and what's all involved in it. Notice it's a hardcover book. It's 480 pages long, and it is black and white pictures and lots of maps, illustrations, and so forth inside the book. This book has three theories in it, three separate ones. It will talk about the city of Ad, or the people of Ad, talks about the people of Thamud, and it talks about the original holy city of Mecca. So three different topics, but they're all wrapped up under one topic, which is the geographical references in the Quran. We look at the Quran and the makeup of it, and we ask the question, what are all of the geographical references that are in the Quran? The amazing thing is that in the entire Quran, only 9 places are specifically mentioned. Now, there's some argument, maybe something else is mentioned or referred to, but actual geographical references only 9 in the entire Quran. The people of Ad, and we wonder who are these people? There's 23 references to them. So they're an important topic in the Quran. The people of Thamud, 24 references. So that is also a very important topic. The Midianites, where is the land of Midian? That's a question we're going to ask. Only 7 references. Medina, only 2 references. Mecca, only 1 reference, called the Valley of Mecca. There's a place called Tuba, and that is, there's 2 references, and Al-Ras, 2 references, Hijr, 1 reference. So in the Quran, there's only 65 references of geographical locations. Very different from other ancient books, which are usually full of names of places and places and things that existed back then. But in the Quran, there are very few. In its place, the Quran refers to a lot of things that are difficult to understand unless you understand the history. For instance, it talks about the dwellers of the town. Now, who is that? The people of the cave. Who are they? The people of the ditch. What is that referring to? The people of the garden. There's the people of the woods. It talks about the people of the fountain. It talks about the people of the tangled woods. It talks about the owners of the elephant. And it talks about the Kaaba and so forth. But it doesn't give us the geographical references for these locations. So some people assume, well, we know where all these places are, but there are questions about some of them. So it's a very interesting study. Now, as we begin the book, I begin talking about the founding of the nations. And I compare the Islamic records with the biblical perspective on how did the nations rise. We have charts and we have figures, and you can look at some of those in the book to try to determine how did the families and the tribes develop. An important person is the person of Abraham, and who were his children. But what about those who came before? The people from South Yemen are different from the people of Northern Arabia. Southern Arabia, down in Yemen and down in Oman, they have different roots than the people in the north. And so they were completely different tribes, also had different languages and language structure. So there are questions that take place, and we look at who are these people who descended from Abraham. This is important to Jewish people, to Christian people, and to Muslim people. So very important to understand the tribal setting in Arabia and the background behind them. Then we come to the interesting question of the people of Ad. Who are these people? There are 23 references to them, and their prophet, Hud. Who is he? And how do we know where to put him in the geographical references of the Middle East? Was he in Saudi? Was he in Yemen? Was he up in the Jordan area or Egypt? How do we know the setting? Now, Dr. Abu Khalil has written a book on the Atlas of Islam, and he suggests that the people of Ad lived around the place called Sishr in Dhofar province in Oman. And I visited Dhofar province, I've been there, and looked at this kind of reference, and I have some questions. What's interesting is that the Western press back in 1992 published a big article. And the article that was flashed across the newspaper and picked up by many newspapers around the world said the lost city of Ubar has been discovered. And people got all excited about this. In time, that story has died. And that's because as historians and archaeologists arrived and started doing some digging and checking it out, they discovered it wasn't the lost city of Ubar. It was a caravanserai or a caravan stopping station. And it wasn't a large place. It wasn't the elusive ancient city of the people of Ad. And so there were questions. You see, the Qur'an tells us in chapter 89, have you not considered how your Lord has dealt with Ad, Aram, possessors of lofty buildings or pillars, the likes of which are not seen in any other cities? Now, this is not a good description of Sishr. Another thing is, it tells us that the people of Ad were destroyed by a furious wind. The Quran says exceedingly violent wind. And he made it rage against them 7 nights and 8 days in succession. So you could see all of the people lying prostrate. So the city was destroyed by a huge wind that came through and knocked everything down. Well, when you come to the ancient city or the place of Sishr, this big caravan stopping station, it had walls around it, had some towers. In the middle, it was basically empty so the caravans could be there. So there were a few buildings, but mostly it's where the caravans came inside the walls, and you could have hundreds of camels being there. And so the city, this place called Sishr, place that they discovered, they all said, oh, this is the ancient city of Ubar. It was not destroyed by wind. Interestingly enough, it was destroyed by a sinkhole. Right in the middle, the ground gave way because there was an empty cave underneath from water action under the surface, and it gave way and caved in, and that destroyed it, not the wind. And so I begin in this book by searching for where is the location of this ancient city, and where were these people, the people of Ad, and how do we find them? And so one of the things we do is we look linguistically at Ad. Ad in Arabic is Ain Aleph Da'ad, and we look at this and we discover that there is in Hebrew a similar name. Written in Arabic, it's also Ain Waw Tzad. It's translated in English as Uz. So we have Ad and Uz, and they're very, very similar. When we look at a list of them, we find out that Ad in the Quran and Uz, which is in the land of Edom, we can compare a list, and it's very favorable. Both have mountains. Both are described as having high places. They are described as strongholds in the rocks. Both had cattle and gardens. There were streams there. They talk about these many columns, or these high columns, and we find that in both locations. They're associated in some way with the people of Thamud who came later. And there are towering rocks. We find that in both places. Deep valleys, both descriptions, and both of them are somehow connected to Pharaoh, who is mentioned in connection with both. And so the book looks in detail, and if you want all the details, you need to get the book and you need to look at it and get all the charts. But both Ud and Uz were destroyed by a strong wind. That is very interesting. And the prophet Hud, very interesting. Where is he buried? He is buried where? Up in Jordan. And why do they find him in Jordan? Because that's where the people of Edom were. That's where the land of Uz was. And we clearly show the land of Uz. It's reference to Uz is Edom. And you will find that, and it gives us an example of that. And so where is Edom? Well, this is in the very mountains where the ancient city of Petra later was built. The Edomites were there first. They lived there, and this was called the land of Seir, or Mount Seir, this row of mountains. So the place where the god Dushera was worshipped. It was a place where the Edomites lived. And in this book, we show that at a time long, long ago, after the time of Abraham, his descendants who were there, while the children of Israel were in Egypt, they rose to prominence. Various groups, all of the brother tribes, the cousin tribes, as we saw in that founding of the nations chart, they banded together and they began to conquer the areas around them. And they were under the leadership of Edom. And they rallied, and we find evidence of this all over the Middle East. We find it in Mesopotamia. We find it in Egypt. We find it down in Yemen. This group of tribes getting together under the leadership of the Edomites. Eventually they conquer down into Egypt. They meet their demise in Egypt, are eventually defeated, and the whole federation of tribes falls to pieces. They all go back to their homelands, and the whole thing is over. And so they disappear very quickly from the scene. These are what Muhammad talks about, the Quran talks about these people, and it makes reference to them, assuming that the audience at that time has a living memory of those ancient tribes when Arabians got together under the leadership of the Edomites, and these are the ancient people of Uz, or Uz in Arabic. Uz is in the Hebrew language. Well, then we move on and we ask the question, well, what about the people of Thamud? And when we take the word Thamud, we can break it down into Thum, which means after, and then Ud at the end is the people after Ud. And so this is Thamud or Thamuz, depending on whether you're looking at the Hebrew or looking at the Arabic. And so these are the people that come after the next civilization that rises in that area. And history tells us that after the Edomites were defeated, the next major people in that area were the Nabateans. And they were the next ones to settle in Mount Seir. Now the Nabateans come in because King Nebuchadnezzar, he comes out of Mesopotamia, he marches across the Middle East, he takes the Jewish people, among all the other nations, he's conquering them as well, he takes these people and he moves the very best of them, or those he doesn't kill, because if they resist, he kills them, those who don't resist, he takes the best of them as slaves back to his land to work his kingdom, and very few people are left. The land is lying almost empty. The very poorest people are left. And so the Edomites, the remnants of the Edomites, they move north. And you'll find when we look at the history of Israel, we'll find, for instance, King Herod. Now his roots go back to the Edomites who moved north into the Holy Land. And so he becomes a leader in that area. So that leaves empty the Edomite lands, because the Edomites are moving up into better quality land. And so these Nabateans, who were living down in Arabia, they begin to move north. And they bring with them their technology. Now, we touched on the Nabateans in this book here, the Nabateans, builders of Petra. What we do is we move on a little bit and we add some more information when we come to this book. For instance, the Nabateans, they were trading. They would have camels and they would cross the desert. We explained in this book that that desert kept these other nations apart. But the Nabateans were the links between. They traded goods back and forth across the Arabian desert. They brought ideas, they brought knowledge, they brought news of what was happening. And so wherever they traveled, the camel caravans were known that they were wealthy. They were carrying incense. They were carrying gold from payment of things. They were carrying other goods, bitumen from the Dead Sea. They were carrying bronze and silver and other articles that they would go and sell in other places. So wherever they went, the local people tried to tax them. I mean, if you were controlling an oasis in the desert and along came this camel caravan, maybe hundreds of camels in the caravan, you would want to tax them before they were able to eat or your fodder or to drink the water from your oasis. So the Nabateans found that it was becoming very expensive. So they adopted something they had seen down in Yemen, which was first developed there, and that was water cisterns. They would go out into the desert, they would find a mountainous area, and you can find these today. I spent quite some time going out into the desert with four-wheel drives with some friends, and we would go find these ancient water systems. They're there, they're all over the place, and often Nabatean inscriptions and writing beside them. Maybe there was a crack in these low rocks out in the desert, low rocks being low mountains, and when the rain came on it, they would direct the water, maybe cut a little channel or put some rocks along, directing the water into one area. If there was a crack in the rock, they would build a dam across it, put an actual, like a tap, a pipe coming out, big cork at the end or whatever, and the water would fill up behind this. What's interesting is some of them we would find holes in the ground just big enough for a small man to get down into. But when you go down into that hole, it opens up like a bell-shaped chamber underground. And had one little hole on top. And they would dig that all out of the rocky, out of the sandstone. Sandstone's easier to carve. And so they would bring all this out. And then there would be a little water channel that would direct the water in. And right where the hole was, they would plunk a rock on top, but the water could get underneath. So the water in these bell-shaped chambers underground didn't evaporate, and there were no signs around that they were there. So people walking in the desert, you see rocks here and you see rocks there, and you're in the desert and so forth. As you're going through the desert, you might be passing hundreds of gallons of water stored somewhere, but you have no idea it's there. But the Nabateans knew it was there. And so they developed these water collection systems all over the desert. And so they could move their camel caravans all over, and they could avoid what was the taxation and what was hindering them to go through certain areas. So they were very tricky, these Nabateans. Now, these Nabateans, they united the Arabian tribes. So here is a map of some of the trade routes in the Arabian desert. And as you can see, the Nabateans had occupied much of North Arabia, the Sinai Peninsula, moved up into the Edomite area. And so they were coming into their own kingdom. They had for a long time used the city, the area called Madat Salah, or the city of Salah. This was their roots where they came out of, having this burial city and being one of their areas where they had traded out of, also coming from the Sinai Peninsula, all these areas south of what we recognize often as the history of the Middle East and so forth. They came out of the desert and moved up into the Edomite area. And there they united the tribes of Arabia. Remember all the descendants of Abraham? Well, all of the tribes of Ishmaels, for instance, the Kedarites and the different tribes that were there, they all became known as the Nabateans under that name. This is told to us by Josephus, that the whole area became known as the Nabateans, even though they were different tribes that were under those names. And so Arabia again was united under one group, the Nabateans, and they built a very powerful economic empire, not necessarily a military empire, although they did have military forces, and we find mention of them and a few different battles taking place over time, but mostly it was an economic empire. Again, as we look into this book, we find another area that comes to us, and this is the Midianites. And what we find as we go back, and if you look at the history of the Midianites, there was a time when all of the tribes of Arabia united under the leadership of the Midianites, and they began to conquer the surrounding areas. And they would come in, oftentimes just coming and taking everything that they had, eat all their food, take all their goods, and just move on. So is it any surprise that the Quran speaks to us of the three most important geographical references in the Quran are the people of Ad, the people of Thamud, and the people of Midian. And if we go back, we discover that each of these peoples that are mentioned were at one time united Arabia, conquering and influencing the outside world. Very, very important perspective in the minds of the writers of the Quran. This is a very important background. If you don't understand this background, you don't understand the impact that this had on its writers. Now, what is interesting is that in the Quran, there are some surahs or chapters which we call the Meccan surahs because they're the earlier ones, and they came out of the original holy city of Islam. Then there are surahs which are the Medina surahs, and these come out of the time when Muhammad was in Medina. Now, if you look at the geographical references in the Quran, you will discover that when Muhammad was in the original holy city of Islam, which we now know is the city of Petra, when he was there, he referred to the people of Ad. And he could do this because he simply had to point to them, to the ruins that lay around, because this was where the people of Ad used to live. This is where the lofty columns were. This is where the whole thing took place. And so the people that were there, as these verses are being revealed to them, they're relating it back to the people of Ad. He doesn't speak of Thamud until he moves down to Medina. Now, on the way down to Medina, all of the people who were leaving the city of Petra on the Hijrah, on the emigration, and moved down to Medina, they passed through Mada Salah. And there are these huge carvings in the rock. There are all kinds of them, and they're scattered around an area. It's not a very big area, but all of these different rocks and valleys and so forth have all of these Nabatean tombs in it. And it's in that setting that Muhammad talks to them about the people of Thamud, because he's passing through the very area in the center of Arabia where the Thamudic people were. And so he speaks to them. And so when he's in northern Arabia, he speaks of the Midianites. 3 times, remember that, 3 times Arabia united and impacted the world under the people of Ad, or the Edomites, under the people of Thamud, or the Nabateans, under the Midianites and the huge armies that they assembled. And lastly, his dream is to unite Arabia again. And so the 4th time is under a united Arabia. This time the Muslims move out again. So very, very strategic. The geographical references in the Quran are very, very strategic in leading the audience on to understand what took place in the past and what God is saying to them about the future. And so this is the message of the Quran, just a very big overview of this. Now, at the end of this book, we turn to that city of Mecca. And at the time, this was a very shocking thing. We begin here, and we talk about Mecca and what was the city of Mecca. And we look at all those original things that were there. And we ask questions because there are problems. And we go through initially the problems with the city of Mecca. The descriptions of Mecca don't fit Mecca and Saudi Arabia. Then we look at the Qibla direction, and I start going from mosque to mosque that the Qibla doesn't point to Mecca and Saudi Arabia, but pointed either to the city of Petra, or between Mecca and Petra, or parallel. Those are the 4 different places. And so this book introduces that topic, but it doesn't go in detail. If you want to read about that topic in detail, then read the next book, Early Islamic Qiblas, because it goes in much more detail. But this book has a lot of different maps in it. You will find maps. There's a timeline in the back, a huge timeline, going all the way through from year to year, showing, and you'll see different symbols that appear there. So there are some symbols with crossed swords. That's when battles took place. There are symbols with books. This is when important books were written. There are symbols of mosques in this book, and so this is when mosques were built that we can date from. And so if you want the timeline, if you want to read about the reference books that are there, if you want to read about early Quranic copies that are out there, those charts are all in here. And so this is a reference book. It wasn't designed as an easy read that you read through. It's more designed as a reference book, Quranic Geography, or the Geography of the Quran. And this is available, and you'll see it at the bottom of your screen. It's available from starting point stpt.ca, and you can buy the book for $45, or you can buy the PDF of this book, and it's exact same what's in the book, and that's only $15. So that is the book Quranic Geography. It's one of the 3 books, and they overlap a little bit. The Nabateans, builders of Petra, followed up by Quranic Geography, and then there'll be a 3rd book that we'll look at next, and these are the 3 books on this topic. Thank you for watching Talking with Dan Gibson, and I encourage you to watch the video, read the books, and then if you have questions, please email me at dan@canbooks.ca. Thank you again for watching.